I'm Kelsey Zeisler. We're here in Austin at the Big 5G event, and I'm joined by Jim Hodges with Heavy Reading. Good to see you, Jim.
Nice to see you, Kelsey. It's been a while.
I know,
yeah.
We still recognize each other, right?
25 months or something. Yeah. So yeah, nice to be here. So yeah, it's been interesting to be at the Big 5G event for the last couple of days. It's been a really interesting show.
Yeah, and you've had a couple sessions that you've moderated. One was on 5G and security. Can you give us some of the highlights or key takeaways from that?
It was interesting because we've all been having briefings and meetings with service providers and clients and vendors, really to understand the whole strategies behind 5G security. We understand the architecture, we understand some of the services, but there's really a lot of sort of kind of below the scenes or underneath sort of the veneer. There's a lot of different moving parts to that, and at that first session at the Security Summit, we talked a lot about that, about really a couple of, maybe two trends. The first is just slicing. There's all these new 5G core networks that are being deployed. We're going to start to see real interest in services that are being sliced, and how do those play out? Are they sliced in a context of for private networks, or just for other types of services? So there's a lot of moving parts to that from a security perspective. And the other part of this is now that we've been talking about for the last couple of years is the ability to run some of these services in public cloud. So that changes slicing, it changes security policy enforcement, detection, anomaly detection. It's kind of like this third sort of pillar that you have to think about in terms of that, and that's causing a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
A lot of, how do we basically secure a service that could be running in a public cloud, telco cloud, or at the edge. So there's a lot of, and we had a really good discussion. At the end of the day, we just kind of came to the conclusion that there's a lot of things have to be sort of play out. Like the industry has to just kind of work its way through it. And from a standards perspective, there has to be a lot more cooperation between standards bodies, because you have kind of cloud services and you have standards for that. You've got the edge stuff, So it's really, there's a lot of complexity now with 5G security, and we knew there would be because of the new 5G core, but just the administration of it and kind of bringing it online with commercial services, and how do you do that from a standards administration perspective. There's a lot more complexity, and I think that's something that you get that in the live event where you get people talking about it in a group. It's harder to do than kind of a virtual world we've been in the last 2+ years. So that to me was, there's definitely more work required from a 5G security. We're not close to being there. We might have a strategy in terms of architectures and the tools, but the actual administration of them, evolving them, there's a lot more work has to be done in that.
Yeah, because I've heard from some operators talking about 5G being inherently more secure, but it sounds like with all these different applications, and like you mentioned, working with the public cloud and then different slices, maybe it's a little bit more complicated than we might have initially thought, or
well, no,
what's the story there?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about 5G has security baked in, you hear that all the time.
Right.
And that's true to an extent, because on some of the interfaces, there's new protocols, some of that will support encryption. But the other part of that is, that's not really part of that. It's where do you run the workload? Okay. How do you steer and really there's really no limitations on where you run the workload. And once you start moving workloads, you have to secure them. And that's the part that's really different about 5G from 4G. So there's more encryption, there are more tools, and ultimately I think if we do it correctly, 5G will be more secure, but there's also going to be more mission critical services. So if there are failures, they'll be pretty visible.
No pressure.
No pressure, yeah.
And you also had some discussions around the programmable telco and private networks. We keep hearing private networks. I feel like we need a bingo card for that one. But.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because private networks is not a new concept. It's been around a long time, and I've been sort of skeptical of the value of private networks from a service provider perspective. I think, maybe just an enterprise who wants to build their own private network, that's something they can do. But once they want to kind of integrate it with a telco, sort of have a full-on integration, I think that's a different part of that. But I think one of the things that came to me in the sort of the aha moment of that session that we did was that, programmable telco was this concept we have about running any workload, VNF, CNFs, running with the edge. So the notion that the service provider can run these services anywhere, which we just talked about, is more complex from a security perspective. It has a lot of value from an end user, enterprise, or a consumer perspective. And I think because of that, we had a couple of people in the panel saying, well, private networks, a couple of years ago, we couldn't have built the same type of private network we can build today, because we have software programmability tools, we have OSS, service assurance tools, so all these things are kind of coming together, and I think that's what's really driving this. It's not just private networks because of 5G faster access, that's a part of it, but I think a big part of that is now we can kind of, through software, we can customize a private network for one industry vertical versus another, and they're all different verticals, and they all have different requirements and different performance tolerances and latency budgets. So I think it's now is kind of like, to me, the reason the private networks are being kind of, there's a lot of market hype around them is because they are not just private networks, to me I would add the word programmable. They're programmable private networks, whereas a couple years ago they weren't programmable. It was kind of like, the concept was build the network, it's end to end, but now they're much more programmable with software tools, and that makes it a lot more valuable, I think.
Okay, and kind of building off of that, are there discussions around, you mentioned customizing those private networks. Are the service providers looking for ways to make private networks somewhat repeatable so that they can kind of start with a baseline for these different customers and then add on customizations, or are we still kind of figuring that out?
I think they're figuring it out. I mean, there will be certain key tenants, right, of certain, like a private network will have certain requirement connectivity, but at an application layer, I think that's going to differ from, and that's what will make them kind of value add. That's what the pricing will be different for, depending on what the tolerance of the KPIs, what, car manufacturer, steel plant, or whatever they're doing, they have different requirements. So again, that's the value of customization, being programmable telco, being able to do that and sell different types of private networks, whereas you couldn't do that before. Before it was kind of like, this is what it looked like, this is what you're getting. If you don't use all the bandwidth, that's fine. But so yeah. So it's an interesting time. I mean, I think for me, being here, this first event I've been to in a couple of years, I think there's a lot of interest. There's a lot more. I think we have a better vision of where we're going with services, but there's also a lot of extra complexity, and part of that is this we've talked about hyperscalers, and we've been talking for the last couple of years about how they'll play. When we've seen announcements about vendors and service providers making these announcements, and that's going to add a lot of value, and it's going to add a lot of scale, but it's also adding undoubtedly complexity.
Yeah, the tricky frenemy co-opetition issue.
Co-opetition, whatever it's called, but just even the fact that they've got their own networks, and they've got their own protocols, and they've got their own ways of managing and doing service assurance, and all those things are all different. So there's a lot of complexity from security, private networks, so it's an interesting time. I think we're at an intersection where software programmability is really going to be a key part of this. We just kind of have to work our way through it and not do it in our pajamas on a Teams call for the next 2 years, and just kind of get here and have real solutions. Kind of meet face to face. So,
well, that's a good motivator.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. It's been really interesting. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.